Welcome, friends, to Beyond the Crucible, the podcast that dares to talk about setback and failure, but not so we can commiserate and so we can elevate. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our mission today, and we choose to accept it, our mission today is to offer you the hope that your crucible experiences, those setbacks and challenges you have faced in the past or are facing right now, do not define you. They refine you. They did not happen to you. They happened for you. And I don't know many people who know that better, who exemplify that better. And I know a lot of people. I don't know many people who know that better than the founder of Beyond the Crucible, the host of this show, and my friend, Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, we've got another. It's fun to get back into the rhythm of interviewing guests. We have another fascinating guest today who will offer some insights and some inspiration for our listeners and viewers, I think.
Absolutely, Gary. Very much looking forward to it.
And that guest, folks, is Jason T. Smith. Jason is an accomplished physiotherapist, dynamic businessman, and award-winning leadership expert in high demand. Failed medical missionary, reluctant businessman, unqualified franchisor, all leading to accidental founder and CEO of Australia's largest physiotherapy network at the time, the Back in Motion Health Group, creating an unlikely success that surprises himself even more than those around him. Ernst Young Entrepreneur of the Year, Jason believes the opportunity of a lifetime comes around about once a day. He made a career out of getting it wrong more than he got it right. He's in the perfect place. He never wanted a business, and yet he ended up with over 140 of them, supported by a team of 700 plus people and eventually selling for over $100 million. No, I didn't say that wrong. Initially a leader by chance, Jason has now mentored over 1,000 others like him through the Iceberg Leadership Institute. A regular contributor on business leadership and health-related topics, you can hear his thoughts on podcasts like this one, television, radio, and online channels. Jason is also the author of 3 books, including his memoir, Unlikely, from Arkhouse Press, published just this year, a keynote speaker, and a missional justice advocate. We're going to get to all of that stuff, folks. Warwick, take it away.
Well, thank you, Gary, and thank you, Jason. It's an honor to have you here. I loved reading your book, Unlikely. I mean, what a story. I mean, incredible, which we'll get into. Very grateful that our mutual friends, John Sycamore and Glenn Williams at Halftime introduced us. And great to hear that you are the, new chairman of Halftime Australia. So love what they do. And it's such an important mission and ministry. But obviously, through much of your working career, it was involved in Back in Motion, this physiotherapy business throughout Australia. But before we get into that, I'd love to hear just some of the backstory. You grew up outside of Melbourne, or I guess Melbourne suburbs. So tell me, kind of what were your parents like? What was life like for young Jason Smith growing up in the suburbs of Melbourne? And obviously, you never dreamed of where you would end up. And needless to say, life tends to be like that. But what was it like for a young Jason Smith, and what were your mum and dad like?
It's always good to go back and reflect, isn't it, on where our stories began. But thank you for having me on your podcast. It's a real privilege and honour. Young Jason, look, it's interesting because when I was even preparing some of those early chapters in the book, and I did go back to some of my childhood, I was tempted to think, gee, it was vanilla. It was just beige. It was just middle-class suburbia. There was nothing spectacular. And it almost deceives you into thinking that those origin stories don't matter. But they do. They're formational. They're transformative. They, of course, are the roots of who we become. So Dad was a Navy man. His brother was in the Army, and his dad was in the Air Force. So I come from a line of military personnel, and they were all manual labourers within those forces. So fitters and turners, mechanics, very good with their hands, engineering minds. And it was kind of almost a fait accompli, I think, that I was meant to become a blue-collar worker in some sort of military corps And I just completely missed that genetic code. It never landed in my DNA. So poor Dad was a very frustrated father at times when he would take me out into the garage on weekends and I couldn't work out which end of the hammer to hold. And he persevered with me, but I did feel like that was a little bit of a missed calling in my life. And then Mum came from a very nominal Christian background in, again, a very middle-class suburban home, the eldest of 3 children, and was in administration working in the docks where the Navy ships would come in, and that's where Mum and Dad met. So by the time I came along, I had one older sister. My dad decided to take an honourable discharge from the Navy to be home more because he was away at sea 6 months at a time. And family became, his greater priority at that point, which I'm grateful for. And I kind of grew up in a strict home, Dad was a straight-laced, very ordered, structured man of discipline, and Mum was the life of the party who could crack a joke at any turn. I just grew up playing sport, good friendships. It was a pretty safe neighbourhood. Life was predictably but not ungratefully great. It was just a nice, fun childhood.
So from what I understand, life changed in your family, I think, when you were 8, and then for you personally when you were 10. I mean, it was a big life change involving faith. So just talk about what happened in your family, what that meant for your family and for you specifically.
Yeah. So, often the habit of kids, at least in our school and neighbourhood, was after the bell went at the end of the school day, we would land at different friends' homes and the parents would have a cup of tea inside while we kicked a football around in the backyard. And that happened on one occasion, and the 2 mums sitting inside got talking about matters of God and church and faith. And my mum decided that we should all start attending Sunday school. And Dad didn't think it was for him, but as a young boy, I just sort of followed Mum's lead, and it became a very real experience for her. And then shortly for me after, at 10 years of age, I had a very dynamic personal encounter with God. And it's hard to put it in words because even at the time as a 10-year-old, you can't reconcile all of the profundity of what's happening in that moment. But there is, at a deep spirit level, a awareness that I had come into a truth of God being real, and I made a decision that my life should be all centered on Him. And then, if your question is alluding to the cartoon encounter, I don't know if you want me to get into that, Warwick, but as a
remind me again about that one.
Yeah, I mean, as a 10-year-old boy, my routine was I would just jump up on a Saturday morning and watch the cartoons, and I'd already made a decision that I wanted God to be a big part of my life, but it was still kind of finding its rhythm. And I'm watching the cartoons. The rest of the house is asleep. And between the episodes of Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner, there are TV commercials starting to run. And you might recall these. World Vision, I'm sure it happened in America as much as it did in Australia. World Vision started running ads of those Ethiopian children, young, frail, impoverished, distended bellies, flies buzzing around their heads, malnourished cows walking in the background. And then some celebrity would go full face to camera. And for $1 a day, you could sponsor a child. And as a 10-year-old, this was confronting. This was overwhelming. I felt distressed watching this. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, God, if you are real, I'll make a deal. I'll make a pledge with you. I will give my life to become a doctor. We can work together in the developing world and we can go fix this problem. Like, it can't be that hard, you and me working together. This is the musings of a 10-year-old, right? The altruism and sensationalism of a boy who had no idea that Ethiopia wasn't just around the corner out of sight, that this was a big problem. But that was really the catalyst for me in faith, and also in my aspiration to want to become a doctor or a medical professional and work amongst the poorest of the poor.
I mean, it's fascinating how just watching Saturday cartoons that something, a commercial comes and changes your life. I mean, that's
it.
That's mind blowing. But from what I understand, dovetailing into that story, you met your wife, Paulina, in grade 5. And sounds like there was some, her vision and your vision, there was some alignment. So talk about that, because that's sort of an amazing story.
So Paulina, her parents are Chilean, but she was born in Brazil. She immigrated to Australia when she was 10. So grade 5 in Australia, yep, you're about 10 or 11 years old. So that's primary school. We meet and don't have anything to do with each other than share a class together. And we share classes right through to year 10, which is about 16 years of age. And then we separate. There'd been no romance. There'd been no profound conversations. And then we regroup in university. Paulina's now becoming a nurse. I'm becoming a physiotherapist. And at a chance sort of reintroduction, the sparks fly, the romance is definitely present. And so I invite her on a first date. And the first date was terrible, actually. So let's go to the second date. On the second date, the first date would be a podcast all on its own. But on the second date, we literally spoke for 4 hours on a very casual restaurant. And she starts telling me about, having been exposed to extreme poverty in Brazil, having seen favelas, having known firsthand in terms of observation what destitution does to a population. She felt compelled that she needed to give her life to serving the poor. She obviously had a degree in nursing or underway. She was underway with that. She felt like that was a great package or combination. She loved God deeply. And so talk about love at first sight. Talk about a convergence of some of the most profound intentions. We both were in healthcare. We both wanted to serve the poor. As it happens, we had both harbored a dream to adopt a child and play a role in rescuing one life. And these were some of the first things we ever spoke about, which arguably could have been a real romance killer. So we both took a risk there. But we were not painting the life of the white picket fence, the 2.5 children in middle-class Australia. We were talking about grass huts, learning an unknown dialect and living on the fringe of, of an urban or popularised city and really being available for whatever God needed us to do.
So here was the birth of a dream, a lifelong passion, if you will, that you and Paulina would be medical missionaries in some remote, desolate place with the poorest of the poor. And this was a passion, just a passion throughout your lives. And so, here's one of the first challenges or crucibles. So talk about, I guess it looks like it was 1993 and the Victorian leaving certificate, which anybody listening from Sydney, that would be the high school certificate in Australia. And here it's sort of like the end of school SATs. I mean, there's not really an equivalent because it's pretty, if it's anything like the HSC in Sydney, it's pretty grueling stuff, this exam. But you had a vision coupled with being a medical missionary, but that Victorian Living Certificate almost sort of changed your life. So talk about what happened and how that impacted your dream.
Yeah, and you described this desire to be a medical missionary as a passion. I would go as far as saying it had framed my identity. So for 8 years, all of my schooling life, my secondary schooling, I had nurtured the belief that this is what would happen, that this is what validated me, that this was my calling. And anybody who ever asked, I was proud to confirm this is the direction my life would take. I had already written the story, Warwick, right?
Yeah.
Just hadn't lived it. And so when I learned at the end of my secondary schooling that I had missed out on medical school by a couple of points, a couple of percentage marks, it was devastating beyond words that I can explain. In fact, I met someone recently, a young girl who I was leading in our church youth group at the time. So she would have been 13 when this happened, and I was 18 when I learned that I would not become a doctor. And I had picked her and some of her friends up in the car to drive her to an event that night. And that was the day that I had learned that I had failed to meet the threshold. And I don't even remember this, but she says to me many years later, I can remember you were numb. You had no words. You were hollow. You were the shell of a man. And I don't even remember picking her up that night, but it was devastating. So you talk about crucibles. I think that was the shattering of a dream. And I kind of describe it as one of those mirror balls in a disco hall, dropping to the floor and just millions of pieces shattered all over the ground. And I'm thinking, I can't even fix this. I can't fix this. My identity has now fractured. I don't know what I'm going to do.
Talk about how you get from there to physiotherapy. And that's sort of part of the story. But this whole identity thing will sort of come back to this, because it's not like, hey, it was a tough day and you moved to physiotherapy and the dream died and everything was good. We'll get to that part of the story later. But how did you get from, you're applying to medicine, you don't get in, you end up in physiotherapy, which is a crazy sort of a left turn in your life, and you spent decades in that area. And
ironically, I didn't even know what a physio did at the time. I'd never been to a physiotherapist. I didn't know any physiotherapist. I had built a whole Rolodex of doctors. I had gone to, on my weekends as a high school student, I'd gone and sat in medical surgeries and just watched and observed. I'd gone to anatomical museums. I'd immersed myself in that world, but physio was completely foreign. The only reason physiotherapy was an option at that point was because it was the next highest degree in healthcare sciences that my score would have allowed me to go into. And so all my career advisors said, well, if you've got medicine 1, then you put physio 2, and then progressively you just put the lower courses in order. And so it was pure tactical reasoning, no dream or aspiration. But it's interesting because I did get offered a second chance at medical school, and they invited me to a panel, almost like a consolation prize, but I didn't mind. And so I sat there for an hour being absolutely interrogated by the medical faculty at the university. And sitting on that panel was a physiotherapist as an independent contributor to the decision. And they asked me a bunch of questions why I wanted to be a doctor, and I told them about this dream to move into the developing world. And as I left the room, not knowing whether I had succeeded or not in that interview, it was the physiotherapist who got up, walked me to the door, ushered me out of the room, and he whispered to me as he kind of walked past, he said, Jason, I just want you to know, if you're not successful here today, everything you answered about becoming a doctor, I think equally applies to physiotherapy. We need physiotherapists in the developing world as well. And whilst at the time I wouldn't have recognised the significance of that, I think he planted a new seed in my consciousness that all is not lost, that there could be alternative pathways to this. And so at that point, it was pretty clear to me that physiotherapy is my next best option.
So talk about how that rolled out because you weren't thinking about this with physiotherapy. You had a very distinct vision that was different than traditional physiotherapists. It felt like holistic and, it's not just transactional. You want to be transformational and in the life of the patient, and just amazing stuff as I read about it. But then you wanted to grow a business, and, not all medical professionals are entrepreneurs. Most
That's
are probably not.
true.
And so, and you probably didn't even know that you were an entrepreneur. Well, I guess reading your book, there were signs growing up that you were an entrepreneur. There were a few stories in there about all sorts of things you did. So yeah, you could trace back and say, yeah, Jason was an entrepreneur from birth, although you may not have thought about it that way. But so talk about
that's
those.
Right. I think that's the reflection you make.
Yeah. So talk about those early years when you're getting into physiotherapy, and it's not just a medical profession, it's a business, and talk about those early years.
I still hadn't convinced myself that physio was the perfect route. So I did cut a deal with the dean at the medical faculty, which actually hosted both courses, both medicine and physio. And I said, look, if I do well enough in my physiotherapy studies, can I transfer at a later year into medicine? And he said, well, we'll talk about that when the time comes. After my first year, I got the highest grades in the university, and they said, you can transfer into medicine now. So the irony of this is I ended up with the invitation to a back door into becoming a doctor. But within that first year of my physio degree, I had already fallen in love with the possibilities. I was enamored by the creativity that physiotherapists bring to the healthcare space, the innovation, the fact that it was still a burgeoning career, really, an undeveloped, non-prescriptive form of medical intervention. And, in Australia, it was only 100 years young as a profession. And so there was a lot of wet cement that I felt like I could be innovative and contribute to. And so I actually, within 1 year of doing the course, I was a convert, I was an advocate, and I was committed. And I still to this day feel very passionate about physiotherapy. But it's interesting because as I studied and then worked in the industry, and particularly in public health care and hospitals, it was obvious that it was a very reactive profession, meaning we waited till people got sick, got injured, who were in pain, and then we would try and put them back together again. It's very hard to put Humpty Dumpty back together sometimes. And so it became clear to me that a far more progressive approach to healthcare is, why don't we get at the top of the cliff and not just sit at the bottom? How can we coach people into optimal living? How do we enhance optimal lifestyle choices? And so I wanted to pivot physiotherapy from not just being a sickness or injury or pain model. I wanted it to be about, how do I help you live longer and live better? And that sounds pretty cliche, I think, these days, except at the time, 25 years ago, in our space, it was disruptive. It was actually controversial. But all innovative thinking can seed commercial opportunities if you know how to introduce it to the market, which is eventually the path we took.
I want to jump in here because you said something, Jason, when we talked before we were recording about what you just described, and you were talking about getting into physiotherapy, and you said this to me: I just followed the path of least resistance. You said there was no strategy. There was no genius in it. And I think it's fascinating, and it's important for people to hear that, because we say it a lot here. If your first passion, your first vision doesn't necessarily work out, try some things, do some other things differently. Just taking, where it calls them, taking small steps, right? What's the next right step I can take? And you did that. You took the next right step. And in doing that, you learn to both love physiotherapy, important, number one, and then number two, you dreamt of ways to improve it. So talk just a little bit about the importance of keeping moving forward when your first choice, if you will, fades away for folks. Why is it important to keep moving forward? Because you kept moving forward and it changed your life.
Yeah, it's good, Gary. It's always confronting when your own words are repeated back at you. But it's good to be reminded. And this is the namesake of the book, Unlikely, right? It could have been improbable. It could have been impossible. Like, it's not like I sat there and could forecast all of the cause and effect of those decisions I was making at the time. And I do describe myself more often than not as an accidental success, because in the moment, all I could do was assess the opportunities at the time and make what I thought was the next best choice. And being prayerful and believing still that there was a calling on my life, but not sure how to articulate that, not sure how that would be expressed. I think they were all really important framework for those moments. But for the most part, I had no idea of what was to come. And, it's a little bit like walking. And as a physio, the biomechanics of gait is pretty much the core of what we do. But to move forward, to progress, you actually have to fall forwards. Your center of gravity has to move outside your base of support and stability, and you literally have to shift your balance to a place of instability. And that's how we walk. It's just we get a foot in front of us and then we fall forwards again before we get another foot in front of us. And I think it's a metaphor for life, because we make, 60,000 decisions a day. At least 200 of them are conscious ones. And we have no idea, really, the fullness of the impact of those. And so we have to back ourselves.
You're a fascinating combination of both medical professional, but entrepreneur. So you grew your business. You started a franchise business, which I don't think existed in the physiotherapy industry in Australia at the time. So, it grew. So just talk about those years of growth and, sort of 24/7 work life. It's hard growing a business. It's not like a 9-to-5 kind of deal.
Yeah. Anyone who's started an enterprise of any sort, charity, commercial, whether it's a home-based business or whether you're in some sort of executive role for somebody else, you realize there's a really big on button and a very small off button that these that these brands and these ambitions, they're all consuming. They just swallow you up if you're not careful. It's like getting sucked into the vortex. And I think even though I was a very reluctant businessman, and I actually didn't enjoy business. I thought business was evil and dirty, but it was a necessity. Like, there was no way I was going to be able to fund my staff or, provide the services my clients needed without turning some margin on this. So I was kind of like a very, very reluctant participator in this story. Innately, I realized I'm going to have to learn the business of healthcare. And I spent a couple of years sort of fumbling my way through that, feeling totally out of my league in a completely unwanted space. I used to describe it to my wife as a prison without bars. I hated it. And I felt like I'd failed God. I felt like I was working in the very thing I said I never would do. Rather than being on the mission field. And it's interesting because I got to such a low point, and I call it my quarter life crisis because I was only 24 years of age at the time, a bit of an early bloomer. Most people know what a midlife crisis is. That's when they, right. Hang out with a different friendship group, buy skinny jeans, get their hair cut, done a little differently, and buy a Harley Davidson, all of which I did in my 40s as well, by the way. But at 24, I thought, I'm done for. I'm washed up. I'm disillusioned. And I ran away from the business for 3 months. And I won't give you the long version on this, but God really met me on a trip around Australia where I was trying to recalibrate. How am I going to get from where I am to now where I think I need to go, which is trying to work out this business as a vehicle to still impact the lives of disadvantaged communities. And I felt like God really clearly showed me a methodology for that. And it was to build an ethical business with scale so that it would generate an economic engine to be able to do much more than what just my wife and I could do if we went overseas. We could actually send whole teams of people. And I describe it as being an absolute defining moment. Like it was like a switch flicked, not just in my head, but in my heart. And from that point, Warwick, I went from being this recalcitrant kid who didn't want to be in his own business, and I was being dragged along kicking and screaming, to becoming so enthusiastic, like all chips on the table. I'm going for this because I could now see purpose in the method. And it wasn't now about building a business. It was about growing the resources so that we could be significant in these communities that I'd always felt passionate about. So now I had means, motive, and opportunity, the three essentials for the perfect crime. And I went for it. I absolutely went for it. So we grew that one practice. It took me 5 years to get that first practice right. And then once it was a prototype that I felt confident in, we did 12 over the next few years, which was kind of the next innings. Eventually, we got to the point where we were launching a practice every month for a number of years. So, we really started to find our rhythm and mojo. But I put it down to the fact of that conviction that we now had purpose in our method.
This is a great time for me to repeat some more words of yours back to you. In a really positive sense, though, Jason. You said this. I'm so glad you used the word conviction, because you said this. You said convictions trump genius, ideas, and creative vision. Right? Why is that true? Why is that important for people to grasp? Because for some people, it can feel like that's counterintuitive. Why is that so important? Why is conviction the linchpin?
Yeah, I mean, when you read the pop culture, when you read the success stories, and you kind of immerse yourself in what it means to be an entrepreneur or to succeed in business, we're absolutely immersed in this culture that says you've got to be an innovator, you've got to be a disruptor, that you've got to think differently, you've got to take risks, you've got to be all these things, most of which I support, by the way. You've got to be visionary, you've got to have big, hairy, audacious goals. I think these are all good contributors to changing the norm, but none of them are a worthy substitute for conviction. And why I say conviction trumps genius is because conviction, in my lexicon, in my vocabulary, conviction is that transformative belief that I am doing what God intended for me to do, that I'm on purpose, not by accident, that this is intentional life. And that the conviction is more than just a core value. It's more than just an axiom or, a quotable quote. Conviction is something, it's not just what you could do, it's what you must do. You are compelled. And you come up against someone in any context who's living on conviction, they are very, very hard to overcome. They are very, very hard to dissuade. You can put setbacks and barriers and challenges and hardships in front of them, and they will find a way to keep going because it's actually who they are, not just what they do. And I think God shaped me in those crucible moments, and there's been many of them, but I think in those crucibles what God was doing was he was purifying and he was distilling clarity around conviction, not just ideas of what I could build a business around, not just creative genius. He was actually framing me, my identity. And once that's secure and locked in, you actually become unstoppable because it's who you are.
I mean, that is so good what you're saying, Jason. It's just worthy of listeners thinking, what is my must do? What is the conviction that I have to do? I love that So let's talk about a bit more of your story, because just reading your book, I mean, this was not an easy road. It's not like this was Disneyland, back in motion. It's Disneyland, come to work at 9, leave at 5. Everybody's all cheery. And my gosh, it's just been this magical, beautiful experience. It's like, well, that's not real life. So talk about, I mean, you've had a number of folks that didn't work out, whether it's franchise owners, finance guy, CEO, GM. I mean, the number of people that disappointed you, so to speak. You had, a government entity, the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, that some might think, gosh, I don't think we have any targets today. I guess we should find somebody, shouldn't we? That's maybe an uncharitable view of it. But some might look at any government entity has their, good sides and maybe their not so good side. So just talk about some of those challenges and personnel in this whole government regulatory body, because they were searing challenges. They were.
And a good friend who reviewed the book before it went to print, who is in his own right a very accomplished entrepreneur, he writes this, he says, about my story in terms of promoting it. He says, discover the chest-tightening reality of risking everything. And that's how it felt. I felt like from one day to the next, this was no resort living. This was not, the life of a wealthy businessman who was dripping in cash and living in luxury. This was warfare. This was, hand-to-hand combat. Leading teams and franchising a brand in healthcare is a blood sport because it hadn't been done before. Most people at their best just didn't think it was possible. At their worst, went out of their way to actually stop it from happening. And so we were the black sheep for many, many years in our industry. And it's hard when you feel this compulsion, like we've just talked about, this conviction, this almost God calling on your life, and yet everything in the natural circumstances around you looks like it can't happen. It won't happen. The hardships are just stacking and compounding on each other. And Warwick, I love how you keep framing from your own story and all the people you've interviewed before this metaphor of a crucible. And I was thinking about this even as I was putting my stories together for the book. I almost see my crucibles as little babushka dolls. So I have this massive crucible, which is, this isn't the life I ever thought I would live. My identity got fractured and I had to reconcile that, which we've touched a little bit on already. But then when you open that babushka doll, you find a medium-sized crucible.
So just for those that might not be familiar, they're sort of Russian nesting dolls, like a little one, and there are ones that fit over them, and it's like maybe 15 or something. And there's a one inside, so there's a whole chain of crucibles nesting in each other, so to speak.
Correct, and they're like all subsets of these headline crucibles. And so I would go to work and I would experience these themes or seasons in my life where there were just legal entanglements, things I was blindsided and ambushed by that I could never have planned for. People stealing our businesses, people, telling mistruths about us to the media, people going to our universities, which were, of course, the hunting grounds for our graduate staff, for whom we would be populating all these businesses, completely distorting our story and our brand and undermining our intentions and just causing cultural havoc within the industry. I would go and speak at conferences, and I would get publicly heckled by people who would stand up under the guise of asking a question, but rather use that opportunity just to berate me for the things that we were trying to do differently inside our profession. I mean, they were really hard years. And lots of opportunities to give up, quite apart from just the commercial difficulties of cash flow and capital investments and managing busy workloads. And so if I didn't have the convictions that we've talked about, if I didn't feel like God had been so clear with me on why we were doing this, I think there would have been multiple moments where I would have just packed it up and gone home. But you don't get that choice when this is what you believe you're meant to do. And so you just put another foot in front and you fall forwards.
You find a way through. One of the things I love about your book is there's a lot of humorous moments amidst the tragedies. And I don't know whether some of us have found that, but there's a theme. Obviously, you wrote it there, so you must realize it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have written it, in which there is this almost innocence. I don't want to say naive, but look for the best in people.
You can say that, Warwick.
I've had my own moments of naivety and trusting the wrong people. And how in middle school, it's like, some people put signs on your back that says "kick me." I probably, both of us have had signs on the back that says "betray me." It's like, really? Seriously? Again? So,
Warwick, I have a PhD. I have a PhD in gullibility.
but here's I don't say it's amusing, but time and time again in your book, you say, Paulina says to me, "Jason, I don't know that that's the right hire. I'm not sure. Trust me, it's good." And time again, it seems like she is right. Now, there's got to be at least a couple times that she is wrong, but it sure seems like, and I think most of us who are married and have wives, it's like, why can't we just realize that they're right? But I guess we're just too stubborn and thick to kind of quite realize that. But just, it's almost amusing. As you look back, are you amused by it's like, why couldn't I have just said yes to Paulina? Why did I just say, no, I got it this time?
Warwick, Paulina's not in the room, and I don't know if she'll even ever listen to this interview. But for the record, let me go on to everybody in your listenership. I am less amused by these reflections. I'm embarrassed. I'm actually disappointed in myself, because when you do the work of reflection and you go back and you distill these stories and you see these themes bubble up, I ask myself, how could I be so blind? When it's like me turning to Paulina and saying, trust me, even though the last 100 didn't work out like I expected, trust me. And I think it's a mix of, I think there's a few things going on there. I think I'm an optimist by nature. And optimism is a double-edged sword, for all the reasons it gives you fuel to push forwards. It also helps you see things that aren't there. I think I also had this mix of faith, which I believed, even if the science looks bad, God can intervene and overrule. And I think that's okay. That's a strong theology, but it's not always going to live out in the reality that you expect. And then I think I was working so hard and so desperate at times for solutions that I was not processing and analysing and synthesising all of my inputs and data points. I was making too many decisions on the fly, which is the nature of people who run big businesses and even small businesses. And I look back now and I'm embarrassed. I'm ashamed. But I learned from it. I learned from my own experiences. Like I've learned more from reading this book from writing this book than I think anybody will from reading it. Genuinely.
It's funny as you're talking. I'm afraid I'm right there with you. We're different, but we're very similar in some ways. I'm not an entrepreneur like you. A lot of things I can't do. I'm more of a reflective advisor. But I'll use that word naivety that you just said about myself. Because, I felt like, gosh, I've been put on this earth by God to resurrect the company in the image of the founder, my great-grandfather, John Fairfax. So here am I, Oxford, Wall Street, Harvard MBA. In theory, I must not be that dumb with that kind of educational pedigree, you would think. And so then I launched this $2.25 billion takeover, and that's 1987. I don't know what that will be in today's money, but that's a lot of money.
I can figure that out for you really quickly, Warwick.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's too much. But, and so one of my key assumptions is, look, I don't want to be CEO. I just want to change management, have sensible management, restore to the ideals of the founder from my perspective, all very idealistic. And my assumption is that other key members of the family won't sell out and allow this then 26-year-old to be in charge of this company, and they can all keep their jobs and positions. What idiot would not sell? Of course they sold out. They wouldn't be trapped in a privatized company run by a 26-year-old. I look back in the years in the 90s, which were pretty challenging years for me, and I would say, how could I have been so dumb? I had a Harvard MBA. I was thinking they wouldn't sell out. It's not like I don't understand business. I mean, how could I? Well, it's a combination of naivety, and I'm all in for the cause. I have very high perseverance, unfortunately, a high idealism, high naivety at the time. So it makes sense now, but still I say, gosh, that was a lunatically stupid assumption. So, with the right toxic mix of God has a plan and I'm naive and, here we go, and, high perseverance, it is possible for smart people to make unbelievably dumb decisions. If I can use the us word, you and I approve of that. So if you don't mind me putting you in my own bin, if
Warwick,
you will.
if that puts me in company with you, I'm honoured to be naive and gullible. But let me balance this though by saying, because when you just selectively pull out the anecdotes where we so tragically and humorously got it badly wrong, it's really good to draw the lesson you're giving. But then there's probably countless times in your career, Warwick, where you made equally seemingly risky, naive, foolish decisions that actually paid off and became part of a huge contribution to the community around you that you may never have otherwise endeavoured to do. And so I think I am naive, I am gullible, I am optimistic, I am hopeful. And a lot of times I get stung in the backside because of that. But also sometimes it comes off. And when it does, it's big. And that's why I say this is the unlikely story, because it shouldn't have worked. But it did. And God had his hand in it. And it took someone gullible to have a go. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because it takes, there's two sides to those attributes.
That is so very true. Yeah, I mean that's a well said. We can't be so hard on ourselves because this desire to think the best, or sometimes we get committed to the wrong things, the wrong vision, or the wrong people. It's so well said. So let's just fast forward to maybe the present day, because a number of years back, I guess it was 2020, you decided to sell Back in Motion, I guess, to another health brand called Healthier for $100 million. So talk about why you decided to leave. And clearly you must have felt a calling to do something a bit different. So just talk about that transition, because it transitions to what you're doing now.
So in the 5 years preceding that, I had already felt a real tug that maybe my season was coming to an end, that God might release me into some new assignments, that this isn't my forever business, and had tried to put a CEO in and just become an executive chairman. Sadly, that failed. So I'm back in the main job, trawling through all this work. COVID hits. COVID is devastating in Australia. We have, in Melbourne at least, over 260 days of hard lockdown under what felt almost like militant rule. The economy crashes. I put 260, which is a staff, which is about a third of our workforce, on furlough. It looks like this is going to end badly. Within a month of that, not only did I recruit all of them back again, and then look to add more to our workforce because we're launching new businesses in the middle of COVID, because we were one of the 4 reasons you could actually leave home and seek treatment. Physiotherapists were an essential service. Our business grew 25%, and we were approached by numerous unsolicited suitors to acquire our business, which then triggered a curious prayer, and that is, God, is this our end? Is this our exit, our off-ramp? Or, am I not meant to be distracted by all this? I commissioned, with the support of our board, a silent auction in behind the curtain. So this was all anonymous. And we ended up with 93 bids on our business, which just created so much competitive tension on price and terms that I felt like God clearly was signaling to me that our time is now, that this was the right part of our cycle. So it was a long process of having to consider all of our candidates. But yeah, we eventually got acquired by an ASX listed, which is the Australian Stock Exchange listed parent entity. I took cash and scrip, so I went on the board of that entity. We acquired lots of other businesses in the roll-up. It became a significant allied health player within Australia, and then slowly over the years that followed, made my exit in terms of operational and personal exertion. And today sit here as a man relatively unencumbered from all of the stress and the strain of that great adventure.
So I'd like to talk a bit about the Iceberg Leadership Institute and what you do with Halftime. But one question that certainly anybody that's been in business or founded something knows is, once you leave something that you founded from nothing back in motion, there can be an identity crisis. Glenn Williams, a mutual friend in Halftime, he talks about some of this stuff in his book. There can be this question, who am I if I'm not the founder and CEO of Back in Motion? There can be this, well, I'm nothing. Did you go through any of that, or to the degree that you did or didn't? How do you handle that? What can be an identity crisis when you're no longer the head of this big, well-known organization?
I think I was prepared for this. I think there was, I'd read a lot, been mentored through the work of Halftime, knew something about what was to happen in this transition. And so it wasn't like a blindsiding as much as it was, how do I prepare for this? I also think maybe a little differently in my case, because I never wanted the business in the first place, because this actually wasn't my plan for my life. And I write about the cliche imposter syndrome that I struggled with for most of the 25 years I ran the business. It was almost relief when I sold it, rather than a deconstruction of my identity. It was almost going back to my original identity formation, and that was, I've been through this 25-year adventure. It's developed my character. It's built resilience. I've learned something about scaling and leading teams and changing culture and facing hardship. And God's graduating me from the school of hard knocks. And now I'm returning to some real heartfelt passions which sit as cornerstones in my identity. So for me, I don't think I crashed when I sold the business in the same way I have read and heard others might have.
So let's just talk about just what you do now as we begin to close. I love just looking at some of the stuff with the Iceberg Leadership Institute. Some of the things you say, 90% of what makes you an effective leader are the attributes beneath the surface. Talk about level 1, discovering leadership. I love level 2, self-leadership. A lot of business people do not think about self-leadership, so that's awesome. Team leadership, organizational leadership. So talk a bit about that and Halftime. You're clearly passionate about it. So why is this so critical for anybody that seeks to lead and make an impact in life?
Yeah. Well, with the exception of God's providence, which I think is themed very well in this conversation today. I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for strong, passionate, directive mentors. And from the age of 15 to now, and I count myself very fortunate, but I have never not had either a father or a peer who has guided, coached, supported, and journeyed with me in not just business, but life. And so I think this is a really important part of self-mastery, living our potential, realizing our calling, and living our best lives. So I'm committed to this. In the marketplace, we call it coaching and mentoring. In the church, we call it discipleship. Essentially, what we want to do is pay it forward, develop leaders around us, because we're built for community. So the Iceberg Leadership Institute, initially that was developed over 15 years ago for me to raise managers within my own business to be able to keep growing our footprint. It then morphed into an industry-wide opportunity where I was training people across all sorts of healthcare professions. And now I'm coaching and mentoring executives and CEOs and people of all professional types, charity, not-for-profit, church world, because the principles of leadership are completely transferable. And so that consumes a fair amount of my time. And then Halftime, which is a completely separate entity, but has very many attributes in common, is this initiative that is devoted to helping people transition in business from these concepts of pursuing growth and success and financial return, all of which are valid, and helping them connect to purpose and significance and building community and investing in others and realizing some of their best fruit grows on other people's trees, and helping them realize that you can actually live parallel lives in your positions of influence and affluence. And so that's roundtable forums, it's keynote speeches, it's individual coaching. And so it's a very fluid world, but you can, I'm sure, hear that there's a lot of themes in common.
That sound you just heard, folks, was the captain turning on the fasten seatbelt sign, indicating we have begun our descent of this conversation. But don't get up yet. Collect your belongings. Get ready your peanut bags. Warwick's still got a question or two left, so take it away again, Warwick.
So, Jason, again, thank you. I just love listening to your thoughts in this conversation. There could be somebody here today, maybe it's their worst day. They're in the midst of the crucible. Maybe they don't even know whether, am I following my vision, somebody else's? I don't know if they're a reluctant missionary in where they are, but they may not be doing well. So what would a word of hope be for somebody that might be, this may be their worst day, or they might be just in the midst of it and there's no hope, there's only down, it's just grim. What would a word of hope be for that person?
Well, firstly, for anyone who is having a difficult time right now, be assured, for the most part, this experience is shared in common with people all over, that this isn't necessarily of your doing. It's not something you caused. Even if you did, it's not something that has to remain your forever story. So I would just speak some hope, because most people we know, Gary, Warwick, ourselves, these are not unique experiences that we're talking about today. They just come in different colours and different shapes and sizes. But I would just add to that if I reflect on my journey, if everything I had touched had worked, if everything I tried succeeded, if all the things I had hoped had come about, I don't think I would be half the person I am today. We all want to grow into greatness of some sort, but I genuinely believe that our character, our resilience, our determination, the best attributes of us, the bits people like in us, they didn't develop in the bright sunshine of success. Those things all got seeded and then grew in the shadows of hard times and difficult places and tough spaces. And so I would say to anybody who's feeling trapped at the moment, other than calling on people around you to stand with you and to support you, look for the learning. Look for the learning and know that between the two peaks of your life, there will always be a valley, but that's still progress. The fact that you got to this valley means that there's another summit ahead of you, and what you learn in this valley prepares you and actually enables you to summit the next peak. And I hope that isn't just motherhood statements. I genuinely believe that. And Warwick, you've read the book. My life, my story is this yo-yo effect of up and down, up and down, up and down, which I think is the common story.
Folks, I've been in the communications business long enough to know when the last word on a subject's been spoken, and it hasn't been spoken yet, only because I'm going to say this that I wasn't able to say earlier. Also naive right here, just so we have a triumvirate of naivete. I wanted to make sure I got them in there. But as for the last word of truly this discussion, Jason has spoken it. So folks, until we're together next time, please remember that we understand, you've heard it here tonight from Jason and from Warwick in particular, that Crucible experiences are hard. They can knock the wind out of your sails. But here's the good news. Jason's proof of it, Warwick's proof of it, is that if you learn the lessons of your crucibles and you apply those lessons and you move forward one step at a time, one small step at a time, it'll lead you to a new destination. And that destination that your bounce back of beyond the Crucible will take you to is the most rewarding one of all, and that is a life of significance. Welcome to a journey of transformation with the Beyond the Crucible assessment. Unlike any other, this tool is designed to guide you from adversity to achievement. As you answer a few insightful questions, you won't just find a label like the helper or the individualist. Instead, you'll uncover your unique position in the journey of resilience. This assessment reveals where you stand today, the direction you should aim for, and crucially, the steps to get there. It's more than an assessment. It's a roadmap to a life of significance. Ready? Visit beyondthecrucible.com. Take the free assessment and start charting your course to a life of significance today.